Next time you're in a crowded place, maybe a train station or a busy coffee shop, take a moment to look at how people are actually interacting. You'll see a man lean in to tell a woman a joke, and she'll laugh while tilting her head. You'll see a couple walking together, their strides perfectly synced without them even thinking about it. You might see someone subtly adjust their posture or smooth their hair when someone they find attractive walks into the room. These are quiet, mundane, almost invisible gestures. But buried inside these tiny movements is the entire history of our species, and they point toward a reality that is far more complex than the stories we've been told. We've all seen the cartoons of a hulking, bearded man dragging a woman away by her hair, but does that image actually hold up to modern science? How savage was ancient human mating really? Was it a brutal, chaotic free-for-all governed only by the strongest arm and the biggest club, or was it a highly calculated, deeply social dance of negotiation and choice? And if the savage caveman image is a lie, what does that mean for how we understand our own instincts today? Let's move on. The reason we tend to imagine ancient mating as a scene of mindless brutality usually boils down to a misunderstanding of how evolution actually works. We look at the strength of ancient hunters and assume that strength was used to take whatever they wanted, including partners. But if we look at the actual evidence, we find a very different story. The answer to whether ancient mating was a savage free-for-all is a resounding no, primarily because the biological costs of that behavior were far too high to be sustainable. If a group of early humans spent their time in constant, violent internal conflict over mates, that group wouldn't have lasted a generation against the predators and environmental pressures of the Pleistocene. Violence is expensive, it leads to injury, death, and social fragmentation. So, if it wasn't just raw power, what were the actual rules of the game? How did our ancestors decide who got to pass on their genes, and why does the clubbing myth persist so strongly in our modern imagination? Consider this. The clubbing myth persists because it's a convenient shorthand for a version of the past that makes us feel more civilized by comparison. But the truth is found in our bones, specifically in our pelvises and our brains. This brings us to a concept in biological anthropology known as the obstetrical dilemma, a term coined by Sherwood Washburn in 1960. As humans became bipedal, our pelvises narrowed to allow for efficient walking. At the same time, our brains were getting much larger. This created a massive biological problem. Human babies have to be born early in their development, while their heads are still small enough to fit through the birth canal. This means that, unlike a foal that can stand up and run minutes after birth, a human infant is completely helpless for years. This helplessness is the single biggest factor that killed the savage mating myth. Why did this infant vulnerability force our ancestors into complex cooperation rather than simple dominance? And how did this biological bottleneck change the way males and females had to evaluate each other? That leads us to a new mystery. Because human infants are so incredibly demanding, the answer to how we survived is paternal investment and alloparenting. An ancient mother who was forced into a mating arrangement by a violent, unreliable male was a mother whose child was significantly less likely to survive. In the harsh environments of the ancient world, a woman needed a partner who was a provider, a protector, and a social ally, not just a brute. This is where female mate choice becomes the dominant engine of human evolution. Charles Darwin was the first to really hammer this home in The Descent of Man, noting that in most species, the female is the one who chooses. In humans, this choice wasn't just about who had the biggest muscles. It was about who had the best social standing, the most reliable personality, and the best ability to navigate the group's politics. But if female choice was so powerful, why do we still see such a significant size difference between men and women today? And what do our physical bodies tell us about how much competition was actually happening behind the scenes? Here is the problem. When we look at the physical metrics of our species, we can see a middle ground that suggests our mating history wasn't a total utopia of gentle pair bonding, but it wasn't a gorilla-style harem system either. In primates, you can usually tell how a species mates by looking at two things: sexual dimorphism and testes size. In gorillas, where one massive male defends a group of females and fights off all rivals, the males are twice the size of the females. In chimpanzees, where everyone mates with everyone and the competition happens at the cellular level, males have enormous testes relative to their body size to produce more sperm. Humans are right in the middle. Men are generally about 15% larger than women, which is a relatively low level of dimorphism, and our testes size is modest. This physical data suggests that for most of our history, we were moderately polygynous or serially monogamous. We were a species that formed strong, long-term bonds, but those bonds weren't always for life, and there was always an undercurrent of competition. But if our bodies point toward a system of choice and bonding, why does the genetic record show a massive, terrifying bottleneck in our history? Why does the DNA suggest that at one point, only a tiny fraction of men were successfully mating? This takes us deeper. In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Monica Carmen conducted a massive study of Y chromosome diversity across the globe. They found something shocking. About 7,000 years ago, during the Neolithic transition, there was a massive collapse in male genetic diversity. For every 17 women who passed on their genes, only one man did. This is often cited as evidence of extreme savagery, suggesting that a few powerful men or lineages killed off all the competition and hoarded the women. But more recent research suggests a different, more social explanation. This wasn't necessarily a war of individuals. It was a shift in social structure. As we moved from hunter-gatherer groups to settled farming communities, we began to organize ourselves into patrilineal clans. These clans competed for land and resources, and if your clan lost, your entire lineage might be sidelined. The savagery wasn't a man with a club, it was a system of inherited wealth and status that began to dictate who was an attractive partner. This leads us to ask, if status became the new weapon, how did women react to this change in the power balance? And did this shift toward hierarchy make mating more or less consensual than it had been for the previous 200,000 years? There's a catch. The shift to settled society certainly created new ways for people to be coerced, but it also created new ways to resist. Even in highly hierarchical societies, the ancient human mechanism of hidden ovulation remained a powerful tool. In many primate species, like baboons or chimps, when a female is fertile, it is physically obvious to everyone in the group. This leads to a frantic, violent scramble among the males to guard her. Humans, however, evolved concealed ovulation. No one, not even the woman herself for most of history, knew exactly when she was most fertile. This evolutionary trick effectively de-escalated the violence of mating. Because a male couldn't know for sure when a woman was fertile, he couldn't just show up for one day, fight off a rival, and leave. To ensure he was the father, he had to stick around. He had to build a relationship. He had to invest time and resources. This biological shift effectively forced males to trade aggression for persistence and reliability. But how did this need for persistence interact with the reality of human jealousy? If the system was built on long-term investment, what happened when someone cheated the system? Let's look closer. Jealousy is one of the most intense emotions we experience, and evolutionary psychologists like David Buss have argued that it's essentially an early warning system designed to protect that reproductive investment. In the ancient world, jealousy wasn't just a personal feeling, it was a social crisis. Because groups were small, usually under 150 people, everyone knew everyone's business. This meant that mating wasn't just a private matter between two people, it was something the entire group had a stake in. If a man was being a bully or a rogue who tried to take partners by force, he didn't just have to deal with the woman's resistance. He had to deal with her brothers, her father, and her female allies. Richard Wrangham's self-domestication hypothesis suggests that early human groups actually worked together to execute or exile males who were too aggressive. The group, acting as a collective, domesticated itself by weeding out the most savage individuals. This creates a fascinating paradox. The savage humans were actually the ones least likely to survive and mate because they were killed or kicked out by the cooperative majority. So, if we spent 200,000 years breeding for cooperation, why do we still feel like there's a savage instinct buried inside us? And what happens when the social guards of a small group are removed in the modern world? Moving on. The removal of those small group social guards is exactly what defines the modern world, but it also helps us see the ancient patterns more clearly. In the absence of a small village watching our every move, we see the true diversity of human mating strategies. Evolutionary biologists describe this as a mixed strategy. Not every ancient human followed the same script. Some individuals were high-investment partners who focused on long-term stability. Others were low-investment opportunists. The genius of the human species is that both of these strategies could work depending on the environment. In a stable, resource-rich environment, long-term pair bonding was the winning move. In a chaotic, high-mortality environment, having more partners with less investment might have been the better biological bet. This flexibility is why we aren't just one thing. We are the descendants of the faithful partners and the opportunistic rogues. This leads us to a fundamental question. If our history is a mix of these strategies, how do we determine what is natural? And is the word savage even the right way to describe a system that was actually based on ruthless, calculated survival? That is the real problem. The word savage implies a lack of control, a lack of thought. But the more we look at ancient human mating, the more we see a system of extreme social control and deep strategic thinking. Even the most primitive tribes studied by anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries had incredibly complex rules about who could marry whom, often involving intricate systems of skin groups, or moieties, that prevented inbreeding and built alliances between distant groups. These weren't people following raw instinct. They were people following laws that were far more complex than our own. Mating was a way to build a bridge to another tribe, to secure a hunting territory, or to ensure that your children would have a network of aunts and uncles to care for them if you died. This wasn't savagery, it was diplomacy at the most intimate level. But how do we reconcile this diplomacy with the evidence of trauma we find in the archaeological record? If the system was so diplomatic, why do some ancient skeletons show signs of bride capture or violent abduction? Consider the evidence. Archaeologists have found mass graves, such as the one at Schletz in Austria dating back to the linear pottery culture, where the remains suggest a group was attacked and the young women were notably absent from the dead. This points to raiding for partners, a practice that has been documented in various cultures throughout history. This is the dark side of the story. While internal group mating was likely cooperative and controlled, the interaction between different groups could be incredibly violent. The savage behavior we imagine wasn't usually directed at one's own neighbors, it was directed at the others. This is a crucial distinction. Ancient humans were capable of extreme empathy and cooperation within their in-group, but they were equally capable of treating out-group individuals as resources to be taken. This duality is a core part of the human condition. It leads us to wonder, did this intergroup violence actually drive the evolution of even stronger bonds within the group? Did the threat of being captured make ancient women more likely to choose the most protective, highest status males? Let's reframe this. If the threat of external savagery was real, then the internal social dance of the group became even more high stakes. Every choice a woman made, every alliance a man built, was a hedge against a dangerous world. We see this in the elaborate burials of the Upper Paleolithic. At sites like Sungir in Russia, which is about 34,000 years old, individuals were buried with thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and high-quality stone tools. These burials weren't just for the strongest alphas, they were for children and people with physical deformities, too. This tells us that status in the ancient world was about more than just physical prowess. It was about being part of a family or a lineage that had the time and resources to create such wealth. When an ancient woman chose a partner from a family like that, she wasn't just choosing a man, she was choosing a safety net. She was choosing a network of support that could spend thousands of hours carving beads for a child's funeral. This is the polar opposite of savage. It is deeply, almost painfully human. But if mating was about status and safety nets, how did the average person, someone without beads or big lineages, manage to find a partner? This brings us to a new perspective. For the average person, mating was likely driven by the most ancient of all mechanisms, propinquity, or simply being near someone and sharing a common life. When you spend every day gathering tubers, butchering carcasses, and huddling around the same fire with the same group of people, you develop deep, visceral attachments. This is the relatable anecdote of the ancient world. You didn't need a Tinder profile, you had a lifelong audition. You saw how a potential partner handled a rainy day, how they shared food when they were hungry, and how they treated their younger siblings. The savage who tried to fake being a nice guy would be found out within a week. The social transparency of the ancient world made long-term reliability the most successful mating strategy for the vast majority of people. This leads us to ask, in a world where you couldn't hide your true character, did love as we know it even exist? Or was it just a biological trick to keep two people together long enough to raise a child? Let's dive into that. The question of whether ancient people felt love often gets dismissed as sentimental, but the neurobiology of the human brain suggests it's a very real, very ancient evolutionary adaptation. When we fall in love, our brains are flooded with oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin. These are the same chemicals that facilitate the bond between a mother and her infant. Evolution essentially took the mother-child bonding circuit and rewired it to work between adults. Because it was the only way to keep a male and a female together long enough to handle the grueling, multi-year task of raising a human child. If mating was just about a savage moment of physical release, our species would have gone extinct in the first 100,000 years. We survived because we evolved the capacity to become obsessed with a single other person. We evolved the capacity for heartbreak. We evolved the capacity to feel that our own survival was less important than the survival of our partner. This isn't just poetry, it's a cold, hard survival strategy. But if love was a survival strategy, what happens when that strategy fails? What happened to the ancient people who were rejected or who couldn't find a partner in a small group? Here is a new angle. In a small group of 50 to 100 people, the mating pool was tiny. If you didn't fit in, or if you were rejected by the few eligible partners in your group, your options were limited. You could try to marry out into another group, which was a common practice called exogamy. Or you might find yourself in a secondary role within the group. We often forget that mating isn't the only way to be a successful human. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that postmenopausal women, and by extension, other non-breeding members of the group, played a vital role in the survival of the group's children. An aunt who didn't have her own children but helped her sister's children survive was still passing on her family genes. The ancient world had room for a variety of roles, and mating success wasn't always a binary win-loss scenario. It was a fluid, group-wide effort to ensure the next generation made it. This suggests that the savagery of competition was often tempered by the reality of kinship. But if kinship was so strong, how did we prevent the savage reality of inbreeding? Consider the logic. Ancient humans were surprisingly good at avoiding inbreeding, even without knowing anything about DNA. We see this in the Westermarck effect, a psychological mechanism where people who grow up in close proximity during the first few years of their lives develop a natural sexual aversion to each other. This is nature's way of preventing siblings and close cousins from mating. But even beyond that, the archaeological record shows that ancient groups were constantly trading members. A young man or woman would move to a neighboring camp, bringing new genes and new skills with them. This was a form of genetic diplomacy. It turned the savage competition between groups into a cooperative network. You didn't raid your neighbors for women if you could just trade a specialized tool-making technique or a seasonal harvest for a marriage alliance. This trading behavior is one of the things that makes us uniquely human. It requires a level of symbolic thought and long-term planning that no other animal possesses. So, if we were this sophisticated 50,000 years ago, where did the savage caveman idea actually come from? It comes from a mirror. We created the savage caveman because we wanted to believe that the violence and coercion we see in our own world are just leftovers from a primitive past. We want to believe that we are evolving away from a dark history. But the truth is much more haunting. The savagery we see in history, the wars, the genocides, the systems of sexual coercion, Those aren't primitive leftovers. They are sophisticated, modern inventions. Our ancient ancestors lived in a world where their very survival depended on empathy, negotiation, and the consent of the group. They didn't have the luxury of being savage, because a savage person is a person who is alone, and, in the ancient world, to be alone was to be dead. The clubbing caveman is a myth we tell ourselves to feel better about the complexities of our own modern dating world. A world where we have more choices than ever but often less community support than we've had for 99% of our history. So, how savage was ancient human mating really? The answer is that it was exactly as savage, as gentle, as calculated, and as emotional as human mating is today. We are looking back at people who had the same brains, the same hearts, and the same fears as we do. They navigated a world of intense social pressure, deep biological imperatives, and the constant, shimmering possibility of love. They weren't brutes, they were us. They were people who knew that a single touch, a shared piece of meat, or a quiet laugh by the fire was the difference between a life of loneliness and the continuation of the human story. We are the result of their successes, their heartbreaks, and their incredibly complex choices. Think about that next time you see that mundane interaction in the coffee shop. Think about the thousands of generations of negotiation that allowed that one moment of connection to happen. We often talk about the evolution of technology or the evolution of culture, but we rarely stop to think about the evolution of the way we look at each other. Are we actually becoming more civilized in our relationships, or are we just losing the social safety nets that once kept our worst instincts in check? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think modern dating is actually more savage than the ancient world because we've lost that community oversight? Or has the move away from tribal status and genetic diplomacy made us truly free for the first time? Drop a comment below and let's dig into that rabbit hole together. If you find these deep dives into our hidden history as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing. It's the best way to make sure you're here for the next time we peel back the layers of what it actually means to be human. Because there is one final thing we have to confront. We like to think of ourselves as the protagonists of a story about progress, a story where we've left the savagery of the past behind. But the genetic record, the bones, and the very chemicals in our brains tell a different story. We aren't the people who escaped the ancient world. We are the people who carried it with us. Every instinct for jealousy, every drive for status, and every capacity for deep, irrational devotion was forged in a world where the stakes were life and death every single day. We are the children of the survivors. We are the descendants of the people who were strategic enough, social enough, and yes, sometimes ruthless enough to ensure their line didn't end in the dirt. You are not a modern person struggling with primitive instincts. You are an ancient success story trying to survive in a modern world. And the most chilling realization of all is that the savage you're so afraid of isn't some ghost from the distant past. It is the person you see in the mirror every morning. The club is gone, but the hand that held it is yours.